Hello, mortals. I am the booktube goddess, the #1 drag queen booktuber on YouTube. It is time for my top 10 books for 2021. I've read 50 books this year, which is pretty good for me, and I wanted to pick at least one young adult and middle grade to include in this list. As you know, I mainly read speculative fiction, fantasy, science fiction, and horror. So without further ado, let's get started. Now, I waffled about number 10, but I decided, since I did want to do at least one young adult, and I haven't picked any yet, my favorite of the year is Iron Widow by Ziran J. Zhao. This is a debut novel, and the writer's also a YouTuber who credits part of their success through social media memes. And I did a whole video about this, but very basically this is set in a Chinese-inspired far future where this nation or empire is being attacked by these otherworldly creatures, and when they kill them, they can make their huge, enormous, gargantuan, Godzilla-sized bodies into chrysalises, and it takes a male and female to drive them. Only the male is more dominant, and the female sometimes dies. And our protagonist, Wu Zetian, is a woman who turns the tables and is the one that dominates the male. Therefore, she could kill the male part of the driver. Therefore, she is an Iron Widow. It's young adult at its best. The romance doesn't get in the way of the story. The story is thought-provoking and interesting, and there's lots of social commentary. But this is not a perfect book by any means. I did have some issue with the pacing and the character development, pacing being too quick, by the way, and not giving us enough time to connect with the characters or to really understand some of the characters' motivations, which sometimes happened very quickly. But it is definitely a book that I highly recommend. And coming in at number 9, I'm going to put these two books together because I read them back to back and they're part of the same series. It is a memory called Empire by Arkady Martine, and the sequel, A Desolation Called Peace. Now, these are adult science fiction. I've never read this author before, but I enjoyed these books quite a bit. They're different insofar the first book, A Memory Called Empire, is more of a mystery novel where the main character, Mahat Dismare, tries to uncover the murder of her predecessor, and in doing so, uncovers a lot of the politics and the machinations and the issues of this future society. One of my favorite parts of world building in this series is the technology where people download their memories into these devices that can be transferred to the next person in the position, so they're have all the experience and memories and advice of prior people. Now, the next book in the series, A Desolation Called Peace, is more of a first contact situation where the Empire meets an alien race that is intent on destroying them, and how our main character from the prior series, Mahat, is brought in to help negotiate some type of understanding between the Empire and this new species that is not very communicative. If you are into science fiction, please check Arkady Martine out. Coming in at number 8, A Psalm for the Wild, built by Becky Chambers. Now, I have never read anything by Becky Chambers before, so this was my first book. It's called A Monk and Robot Book. And it's a little short, so I think it may be a novella, but it's sold as a novel. So anyway, this story is set on another planet called Panga, and the main character is Dex, a non-binary monk who is trying to find meaning in a utopian society. Now, this society has gone through some sort of ecological disaster, but they came through the other end, and they are very close to nature, or at least don't let technology destroy the planet. They're very ecological. But as part of their past, they split away from robots. Now, Dex is trying to find meaning in life, but instead he finds a robot. And this is more of a philosophical science fiction novel that deals more with the philosophy of self, of duty, of friendship, of what it means to be a being. There's lots of things in this novel that really makes you think, and I hope you check it out. Coming in at number 7 is The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. So this was my first foray into his adult fiction. I think this is his first adult fiction. Not quite sure about that one, but I really did love this novel because it was told in that whimsical middle grade fashion that you see in fairy tales and that T.J. Klune does so well. And I love how our protagonist is sort of this dumpy middle-aged man rather than what we usually think of when we think of protagonist, who is pretty much a social worker who checks in on children with magical abilities when they are being kept in these orphanages. And of course, one of the orphanages is The House in the Cerulean Sea, and we get a gay romance, we get found families, we get a lot of feel-good messages. This author is a feel-good author. And like I said, I was delighted by this novel. I read another one that's actually going to be in my bottom 10 list, but for The House in the Cerulean Sea, definitely deserves to be on my top 10. Coming in at number 6 is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. She also wrote Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. And she has a very deep classic style of writing that I would consider very literary. And Piranesi is a very strange book. It is epistolary, meaning it's in the form of a diary. It has one of the most unreliable narrators you'll ever encounter. And the setting is psychedelic and whimsical and strange. And you feel like if just were on an acid trip after reading the novel, which is exactly what I'm sure Susanna Clarke wanted you to feel. So well done. It is basically about a man who is in a house, and the house is the world, and the world is huge, so it's a huge house. And since he doesn't have any reference to much else, he devises a religion around this house. There is one other person that he knows that exists, so he thinks that the number of people that exist are very small, like 2, except for some dead people. It's a lot. It's a lot, but it's well worth it. Highly recommend Piranesi. Coming in at number 5 is The Burning God by R.F. Kuang, and with that I'm including the entire Poppy War trilogy. Now, I know some people don't really care for this series because it is an anti-hero story, so it's really hard at times, especially the second book, to like the main character. And by the third book, it feels like we're headed into a dumpster fire. But man, I enjoyed the writing, I enjoyed the plot, I enjoyed the storytelling. This is grimdark, emphasis on the grim. It is not for the faint of heart. It pulls you in a whole bunch of different directions. It is basically set in a Chinese-inspired world, or at least the country that we're focused on. Our main character is Rin, and we meet her as a young girl in the first book, and she is determined to get out of her awful, awful home life where her adopted parents are kind of abusive, at least the adopted mother. And through study and hard work, she makes it to go to an academy. And eventually there she finds she has magic powers. And the entire series tracks her rise through the ranks of this empire. And if you haven't read it and like epic fantasy, especially if you like anti-hero stories, strongly suggest you pick up the Poppy Wars. Coming in at number 4 is When You Trap a Tiger by Tay Keller. This is a middle grade contemporary magical realism story that won the 2021 Newbery Medal. It is about a young girl with Korean ancestry who travels to visit her sick grandmother. Throughout her visit, she is plagued by visions of a tiger, which she comes to believe is a figure out of Korean folklore. This is a poignant coming-of-age story that focuses on the complex relationships between mothers, daughters, sisters, friends. Even if you don't normally read middle-grade novels, I recommend you give When You Trap a Tiger a try. And yes, this is one of the few novels that have ever made me shed a tear. Coming in at number 3 is Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. I cannot tell you how much I loved the voice of this book. It's told from Gideon's point of view. It's not first person, but it's told with Gideon's voice, who is this aggressive, crusty, sarcastic, cynical warrior. And if you read the synopsis of this novel, it just sounds crazy. Lesbian necromancers in space. I'm just going to tell you that if you like science fiction or fantasy or both, this is a must-read book. Now, the sequel is another story, and I'll get to that when I go to my bottom 10 book list. But I am telling you, the voice of Gideon the Ninth, the actual writing, the prose is superlative. Coming in at number 2 is The Golem and the Genie by Helene Wecker, and I'll throw in the sequel, The Hidden Palace. Now, of those two books, I think The Golem and the Genie is a better book, but they are both well written, well plotted, with characters that are incredible. I would call this historical fiction taking place in the 1890s New York, and the main character is a female golem, and a golem is a Jewish mystical creature, and a genie, which is a more of a Middle Eastern mythical creature. Of course, in this world, they aren't mythical, but they come from these two opposing cultures, and they eventually meet. I did a whole video on these books if you want to check it out, but suffice to say, one of my favorite books of the year. Almost put it at number 1. If you've heard about this book, you've probably only heard good things about it. So if you haven't read it, what are you waiting for? Go ahead and pick up The Golem and the Genie. And coming in at number 1, I bet you know what I'm going to say. The Inheritance of Orquídea Divina by Zoraida Cordova. The writing almost borders on magical realism, but it is too fantastical to be called any sort of realism. I also did a full video on this one as well, if you want to check that out. The story is about Orquídea, an immigrant from Ecuador who moved to the United States and settled down. She never left her house. She got married several times, had lots of children and grandchildren. One day she says, I am going to die, or she sends out letters saying she's going to die. So come home. She sends these letters out to all her family. Everyone gathers, and we're off to the races on this whimsical, metaphysical, surreal, somewhat horrific journey where we discover Orquídea's life. Amazing book. Please check it out. I can only say that it really resonated for me. Please like this video, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and until we meet again, may all the books you read be blessed.